The disappearance of Calvin Parker's. The summer of 1959 in Fayetteville, North Carolina was sweltering and sweltering when Calvin Parker's disappeared. It was a time when children played in the streets until sundown, leaving behind only clouds of dust on the country roads. The town was quiet and provincial, where everyone knew everyone, and where it was believed that the worst thing that could happen was a lost ball or a scraped knee. But with Calvin gone, the atmosphere changed. The previously quiet streets became a place for anxious discussion, and the forest that began at the edge of town became a symbol of terror and mystery. On the day Calvin disappeared, there was no sign of impending trouble. His mother, Mary Parker's, told her sons to return for dinner, as usual. "Don't be late," she warned sternly, knowing how the boys liked to play games until dark. Calvin's older brother, Tommy, took a friend with him, Richard Brown. Together they went into the woods where they often picked berries that grew along the trail. The forest that adjoined the Fayetteville houses was old and thick. The trees stretched high into the sky, forming a dense canopy through which the sun's rays broke through with only sparse streaks of light. Local children often went there, especially on summer days when the heat made the open spaces unbearable. Tommy led the others behind him, as he always did. He was older and knew where the sweetest berries grew. Calvin followed, trying to keep up, and Richard was the last to follow, glancing back now and then as if he sensed something strange that was bothering him. When they reached a clearing lined with bushes, Tommy sat down to show his brother and Richard which berries to pick. Calvin, curious as ever, scurried off a little to the side. Richard, absorbed in picking berries, didn't notice him moving too far away. Tommy suddenly felt that Calvin was taking too long to answer his questions. He turned around and saw that his brother was nowhere to be found. "Calvin!" shouted Tommy. His voice echoed through the forest, but there was no response. Richard looked up and, noticing the concern on his friend's face, began calling for Calvin as well. There was dead silence in the forest. Even the birds that had just been singing were silent. They scoured the entire clearing, looking under every bush, calling to him over and over again. The forest seemed unusually quiet, as if it was absorbing their cries. Finding no trace of their brother, Tommy and Richard rushed back toward the town with wild fear in their eyes. Mary Parker's ran out on the porch when she heard Tommy calling for her. There was something in his voice that made her heart clench with terror. When the boys told her what had happened, she immediately called the neighbors, and soon the whole neighborhood was up in search. That same evening, the police got involved. People with torches and lanterns combed the woods, shouting Calvin's name, but the boy was nowhere to be found. Rumors of strange sounds and visions began to spread the very next day. Some claimed to have seen shadows flickering between the trees. Others heard low whispers that seemed strange amidst the usual forest noise. One of the old-timers, an elderly man named Henry Woods, said he heard a strange moaning sound coming from deep in the woods, but when he tried to get closer to its source, the sound disappeared as if it had vanished into thin air. As the day went on, the search became more and more arduous. The police brought dogs and even volunteers from neighboring towns to the cause, but all efforts were in vain. Calvin was never found. The forest seemed full of mystery, and every day brought new disturbing rumors. The locals began to avoid the forest. Those who dared to come closer came back with horror on their faces, claiming to feel someone's eyes on them, even though there was no one around. Soon there was talk among the people that the forest may have taken Calvin. But what that meant, no one knew. Weeks passed, then months. The boy's disappearance became a legend, an urban horror story whispered to children to keep them from going into the woods. But Mary Parker's couldn't accept the loss. Every day she went out to the woods, stood at the edge of the trees for hours, calling for her son. Sometimes she thought she could hear his voice, distant and muffled, as if coming through a column of water. But when she ran in the direction of the sound, it was gone, and the forest was silent again. Autumn came and the leaves began to fall, creating a thick carpet on the ground. As the cold weather set in, the search ceased completely. Only Mary kept coming to the forest, hoping for a miracle. But one day, when the first snow covered the ground, she stopped coming. That winter, the Parkers' house, once full of life, was empty. Years passed, and the story of Calvin Parker's became a legend, remembered only on Halloween or when someone dared to go into the woods at night. The town changed. The people who knew Kelvin gradually left and new families took their place. But the forest remained the same, mysterious and frightening. However, Kelvin's story took an unexpected turn decades later. In 1989, exactly 30 years after his disappearance, a group of teenagers from Fayetteville decided to spend the night in the same forest where the boy disappeared. They wanted to prove to each other that they weren't afraid of old urban legends. They took a camera with them to film their adventure. The night was quiet, and the teens began recording their experiences on camera, laughing and telling each other scary stories. Towards midnight, however, something changed. The forest seemed to come alive, and strange sounds began to come from all directions. The camera recorded a low whisper that the teenagers couldn't hear themselves. Then they felt a strong chill, even though it was summer and there was no wind. One of them, deciding to check what was going on, moved away from the fire. The others stayed where they were, watching him. Suddenly a loud cracking sound was heard out of the darkness, as if someone or something had broken a branch. The teenagers jumped to their feet, shining torches all around them. But their friend had disappeared. They started calling his name, but all they got in response were strange sounds, as if someone was laughing quietly somewhere deep in the forest. Terrified, they ran back to the city, forgetting about the camera. The next day, the police found them shaking with fear. They could explain nothing except that their friend had disappeared, just as Calvin Parker's had 30 years earlier. The camera left in the woods was not discovered until days later. When police officers reviewed the footage, they were stunned. The last footage captured by the camera showed a boy standing at the edge of a clearing. He looked scared and alone. It was Calvin Parker's, but his face was as if he hadn't aged a day since he disappeared. The forest in Fayetteville had since become a forbidden zone. No one dares to go near it anymore, especially at night. The disappearance of Calvin Parker's remains an unsolved mystery, and only a few dare to whisper that the forest takes those who dare to disturb its peace. It was in the spring of 2004. I remember that day well. I was a police officer in a small village called Svolver in the Lofoten Islands. Life here was peaceful, quiet. Tourists came and went, marveling at the rugged beauty of the islands, but there were hardly any real incidents. Lofoten seemed to be one of those places where nature rules everything. Cold winds from the barren sea, thick fogs, mysterious mountains. All this gave the impression that time flows differently here. But then, in the spring of 2004, something changed. Not much, but enough that I never looked at these islands the same way again. It all started with a phone call. A local hostel owner informed us that 3 French tourists he had checked in a few days earlier had not returned from a hike. According to him, they were going to take one of the local routes, the one that starts at the foot of Mount Vagakollen, passes through gorges and leads to the seacoast. It's a beautiful route, but like all of Lofoten's nature, treacherous. These are not city streets where it's easy to take a wrong turn and get lost for a couple of minutes. In the mountains and forests of Lofoten, if you get lost, you're truly lost. We didn't immediately panic. Such cases were not uncommon. Hikers sometimes got delayed, lost their way, but almost always returned the next day, tired but unharmed. We decided to give them a few more hours. By midday the next day, everything had changed. The French had not returned. From that moment, our work began. We set out to search for them. Locals and a few experienced rescuers joined us. Our first task was to find traces of their route. Usually tourists, even the most experienced ones, leave traces of their stay torn bushes, paths, fire burns. But the further we traveled along the supposed path, the less we found. It seemed as if the nature of Lofoten had swallowed these people, leaving behind only wind and fog. On the second day of our search, we came to a small clearing in a mountain valley, and then the strangest thing began. We found their camp. The tents stood as if they had been pitched only a few hours ago. None of them were damaged. The ties were tight as a textbook. Everything inside the tents was in perfect order: sleeping bags, rucksacks, clothes, lanterns. Even the food was in its proper place. Tin cans were sealed, bottled water undrinkable. No sign that anyone was getting ready to leave. Everything looked like they had just come back from a walk and were about to grab a bite to eat. But not a single person was there. At first glance, it seemed unbelievable. But the longer I looked at the camp, the stronger the feeling grew in me that something was wrong. I couldn't describe it exactly, but it felt like someone was watching us. A gust of wind blew across the valley, making the tents rustle quietly as if someone had passed close by. We checked everything, walked around the neighborhood, down to the creek, up the slope, but there were no tracks. None. Not a single blade of grass, not a single shoe print. It was as if the men had disappeared right out of camp without leaving behind the slightest hint of where they might have gone. By the end of the day, I began to feel real fear. Not the kind of fear you get when you're in danger, but a deeper, animal fear. The fear that you don't understand what is happening, and that everything around you is alien and hostile. The other members of the search team were tense too. We exchanged brief glances, as if one of us wanted to ask but didn't dare. We decided to stay the night, camping nearby. The night on Lofoten at this time of year was cold but not deadly. We made a fire and tried to keep warm, but the silence that surrounded us was crushing. Usually at such moments you hear the sounds of nature, the wind, birds singing, grass rustling. But that night there was nothing, not a single sound. Even our voices seemed muffled, as if the air had become denser. I woke up in the middle of the night to a strange noise. It was something like a quiet, barely audible whisper coming from the edge of the forest. I stood up, listening. The sound was so quiet that I couldn't pinpoint its exact direction. The feeling that someone was watching us intensified. I turned back to the camp and looked at our men. Everyone was asleep, but I was sure something was out there in the woods. In the morning, I talked about my sensations. No one laughed, but I noticed that my colleagues avoided looking me in the eye. Perhaps they felt the same way but didn't want to say it out loud. For the next 2 days, we kept looking. We surveyed every metro within a radius of several kilometers of the camp, calling their names, sending requests for search helicopters, but nothing. It was as if the ground had just swallowed these people up. It was inexplicable. On the 4th day of the search, one of the investigators from Tromsø came to see us. He listened to our report, looked around the camp, but there was no answer in his eyes. It looked as if the place was frozen in time. The only thing that remained was the inexplicable terror I felt all this time. The search continued for a few more days, but there was no result. The tourists were reported missing. Their bodies were never found. This case became one of those stories that are passed from one police officer to another like a legend. Whenever I hear about tourists hiking in Lofoten, I have an involuntary urge to warn them. But what can I say? That somewhere out there among those mountains and forests, there are places where people just disappear. Since that incident, I have often returned to that day in my thoughts. I have dreams of walking through that camp again, hearing those whispers. In these dreams, I come to the edge of the woods and see something that words cannot describe. But every time I wake up, all the images are blurred, leaving only a feeling of inexplicable terror. The Lofoten Islands, with their beauty and harshness, hide something more than just nature. Perhaps it is something ancient that has always been here, hidden from our eyes but sometimes manifesting itself, taking those who fall into its web. I don't try to understand it anymore. There are too many questions we will never have answers to. I still can't forget that case. Many years have passed since I first came to the voodoo swamp, but even now, every time I close my eyes, I see the thick fog in front of me, hear the squelch of mud underfoot, and smell that unbearable, stifling odor of decay that filled the air. It was 1976. I was a young detective in Louisiana, fresh off my badge and ready to change the world. I didn't know then that one case could change me. It all started with a call from the sheriff in a small town nearby. A family from Texas, a husband, wife, and their 2 children was missing. They were traveling by car through Louisiana on their way to visit relatives in New Orleans, but decided to make a one-night stop at the voodoo swamps. The swamps were known locally as a dark and mysterious place. There were many legends about them, mostly among the old-timers and people living nearby. It was said that something ancient lived in these swamps, something beyond our comprehension. When the family did not turn up at their destination the next day, The relatives became worried and called the police. The authorities immediately dispatched patrolmen to search the area. Those found their camp 2 days after the disappearance. No one was there. The camp looked quite ordinary: a tent, a fire pit, half-eaten food, and a few things scattered here and there, as if someone was just going to have a snack. But there was one odd detail. There were footprints in the mud around the camp. Huge footprints, as if someone or something had walked right through the swamp. It was hard to believe their size was completely abnormal, not like human or any animal tracks known in these parts. I was assigned to investigate the case. When I arrived on the spot, for the first few minutes everything seemed normal. Silence, damp air, a faint mist over the ground, and the marsh quietly bubbling somewhere in the distance. But the more I looked around the camp, the more ominous the place seemed. The smell. I'll never forget that smell. It was everywhere, like rotting flesh, like death lingering all around. But there were no bodies. I began to examine the footprints. They were fresh, as if someone had just walked through here. I tried contacting local hunters, biologists. No one could explain their origin. The size was such that it was hard to believe if they were legs. The creature must have been at least 3 meters tall. We checked the neighborhood, the forests, the trails, but found no sign of the family. After a few days, the case began to fade. The police wrote it off as an accidental disappearance. Maybe they got lost in the swamps and drowned, and the bodies just got sucked in deeper. But I couldn't help feeling that something was wrong. It was as if the very air in those swamps held a terrible secret. One night I decided to go back there alone. I took a lantern and a map and went deep into the swamp, to where the tracks had been found. The swamp was very different at night. Everything around seemed alive. Every rustle, every sound was like a voice from the past. I stood at the water's edge, staring at the reflection of the moon in the dark, oily surface. And then I heard it. A whisper. Quiet, barely perceptible, as if the wind was gliding across the water. I froze. The whisper grew louder, but the words were indistinguishable, as if they came from the distant past. Suddenly I saw the water ripple, as if someone or something was moving beneath it. I thought it might be a fish or an animal, but my heart beat faster, and my feet were beginning to back away slowly. Just then, figures appeared out of the mist. At first they were barely visible, like ghosts among the trees. I shone my torch on them, but the light seemed to make them less real. They were people, or what had once been people. Their skin was gray, their eyes blank, and their bodies contorted as if they were melting in the sun. They moved slowly, like marionettes controlled by invisible threads. I froze. The figures were getting closer, and with each step they took, the smell of decay grew stronger, as if the swamps themselves were spitting their rot to the surface. And then I saw it. It was coming up behind them, a huge, dark thing, something that could only be seen with the corner of my eye. Every time I tried to concentrate, it disappeared, but I knew it was there. There was no doubt about it. I felt an icy fear gripping my entire body. It was something as ancient as the earth itself, and it was staring right at me. It was a living embodiment of the ancient legends I'd heard about from the locals, the spirits of the swamp, the creatures that lived in the dark waters, worshipped by the old voodoo shamans. I don't remember how I ended up back in the car. All I remember is running, an endless run through the swamp, the fog, and the sounds that followed me. I returned to town the next morning, completely shattered, with pain in my chest and a feeling that I had not emerged victorious from this bout with the unknown. I tried to tell my colleagues, but no one believed me. They put it down to stress, fatigue, and I stopped talking about it. However, something inside me changed forever. A few years later, the case was closed without any explanation. The family was reported missing. But I know the truth. What lives in the voodoo swamps doesn't want to be found. It's something ancient, something evil. I don't know where they disappeared to, but I'm sure they never left those swamps. Now when I hear stories of missing people in those parts, I shudder. I can't forget that whisper, that smell, and those ghostly figures that moved in the mist. The voodoo swamps took them over, and one day I'm sure they'll take someone else. Lapan National Park, 2009. This was supposed to be a common occurrence. I had been working for the Lapan National Park Rescue Service for a few years now, and searching for lost hikers, although rare, didn't seem unusual. However, that day, 13th December 2009, changed my life and the way I see the park forever. It all started with a call in the morning. A young couple, Anna and Eric, were out for a walk in the winter park. It was their first visit here, and they didn't seem to know that you can easily go off the trail in these parts, especially in winter. When they didn't return by the appointed time, their friends sounded the alarm and we started searching. I was part of the first search party. We were sent along one of the popular trails, the same one where the couple was last seen. The weather was getting worse by the hour, the snowfall was getting heavier, and the wind was howling through the forest, drowning out any sound. We walked cautiously, checking every detail on the snow-covered ground. The trail they were following was almost obliterated by the snow, but soon we were lucky. We came across their tracks, which stretched forwards through the drifts deep into the woods. At first glance, everything looked normal. The two of them were walking together, with no signs of panic. But the further we walked, the more something was unsettling. I had a strange feeling as if someone or something was watching us from behind the trees. At first, I thought it was just nervousness. After all, a forest and a snowfall can create false images. But the further we got, the stronger this feeling became. Suddenly, our partner stopped. "Look," he said, pointing ahead. After about half a kilometer right on the trail, the tracks abruptly stopped. I walked closer and crouched down to get a better look at them. Yes, they were their tracks, and they were just disappearing, as if someone had picked them up in the air. "That's impossible," someone in the group spoke softly. "They couldn't have just disappeared." We stood in silence, looking around at our surroundings. The forest was quiet, but not in a good way. There were no birds, no animals, nothing, just the howling of the wind among the trees. "Let's try to scour the neighborhood," our leader finally decided, and we split up. I went in the direction of the dense forest, separated from the trail. With every step I took, the feeling that someone was following me grew stronger. I turned my head but saw no one, only the shadows of the trees, muffled by the snowfall. Every sound seemed suspicious: the crunch of snow underfoot, the crackle of twigs, the rustle of wind. I didn't know how long I'd been walking when suddenly I came upon a strange object. It was a scarf. A woman's scarf caught on a low branch. I picked it up and realized it belonged to Anna. Her friends had mentioned that she wore one just like it. The scarf was perfectly clean, with no trace of snow, as if it had just fallen. "Did you find something?" asked my partner on the radio. "The scarf," I answered. "It belonged to Anna." Strange that it wasn't covered in snow. I looked around. The forest was empty, but the shadows of the trees seemed to be coming towards me. Looking up, I saw that the sky was covered by a dense cloud cover. The sun had completely disappeared, although it was still daytime. Turning around, I realized that I had strayed too far from the trail. "Get back on the trail," the search leader told me, but my radio signal suddenly started to crackle and disappear. I tried to contact again, but the answer was silence. It was like the signal was blocked. Then I was terrified. I realized I was lost. It was easy to get lost in this forest, especially in this weather. The trees around me were tall and old, their branches hanging down in heavy shadows, and they seemed to be watching my every step. At one point, I heard footsteps. Slow, cautious footsteps that approached me from the direction of the forest. I turned around sharply but saw no one. "Who's there?" I shouted, trying to hide the fear in my voice. There was no response, only silence. Suddenly, a strange figure appeared ahead. A human silhouette standing motionless among the trees, almost merging with their trunks. I froze. The figure didn't move, but I could clearly see it standing there, staring at me. My heart sank in my chest as I realized it was definitely not one of our searchers. I took a step back, keeping my eyes on the figure, but she still didn't move. Fear paralyzed me, but instincts took over. I turned and ran back to the trail without looking back. My lungs stung from the cold, and the snow made it hard to run, but I kept running. The only thought in my head was to get away from what I had seen, but when I reached the trail, no one was waiting for me there. My colleagues were gone. In desperation, I started to call them on the radio, but the answer was the same, just deafening static. The trail ahead disappeared into the snowy gloom, and I suddenly realized that I no longer knew where I was. There were those footsteps again. This time they were right behind me. I didn't want to turn around, I couldn't. I just kept walking, quickening my step until the shadows of the trees around me began to thicken. The forest seemed to shrink, and it was as if the trees were not just standing there but watching my every move. Then I realized it wasn't just missing tourists here. Something ancient, evil, lurked in these woods, and it wasn't going to let me go. Conclusion. I don't know how long I walked through the forest until I got to the station, completely exhausted. I never saw anyone from the search party again. I was picked up by helicopter when another searcher turned up the next morning, but Anna and Eric's bodies were never found. I'll never forget those eyes. Small, too small for a human face. Deep set, they seemed frighteningly inappropriate for that smooth, rubbery face. Too perfect, unnaturally taut like a mask, but it wasn't a mask. In that moment I realized that a person could meet more than just other people in the mountains, and if I had known then what was waiting for me on the pass, I would never have decided to take that hike. But there was one thing, I couldn't go back. At a certain point, you just have no choice. You can't run away. Even if you try, something will still catch up with you, and when it does, no matter what you do, no matter what you try, you'll realize you've been running into a trap all along. That was in the winter of 2018. I'd been wanting to go solo hiking in the mountains of Colorado for a long time. I loved the rugged wildness of these places. The snow, cold, and wind all added a sense of solitude that I sorely lacked in the hustle and bustle of the city. The hike started normally, clear skies, snow crunching underfoot, and a light wind that occasionally blew into my face, burning my skin. I was ready for anything, except for what happened on the pass. Dusk came quickly. When gray clouds covered the sky, I decided it was time to find a place to camp, but something kept me going. I remember exactly the moment when I noticed a faint light in the distance. Someone had made a fire, deep in the forest, among the trees. It was strange. At this time of year, you don't often see other hikers on the pass, especially lonely ones. It was not the presence of the fire itself that caught my attention, but the silence around it. The wind had almost died down, and there was such an unusual silence that the hair on the back of my neck stood up. I headed for the fire, hoping for company, or at least the warmth of companionship. All around, the forest stood mute, each step through the snow sounding too loud. As I approached the fire, I saw him. A man was sitting with his back to me, wearing dark, strange clothes that looked old-fashioned. He didn't move, as if he was frozen. I called out to him, but he didn't answer. Something pinched inside. It was strange. Perhaps I was just tired, and was trying to find an explanation for my fears. The feeling seemed to grow as I approached. And then, when I finally got closer, I saw his face. The first thing that caught my eye was that his face was too smooth. The bright light of the fire cast unnatural shadows on it, and his face looked like it was stretched, too perfect. Like it wasn't skin but rubber, without a single wrinkle. Everything looked like it had been stretched over something alien. But even more horrifying was his eyes. They were too small for his skull. It seemed implausible, as if someone had put the man together piece by piece but didn't know what a human face should look like. A wave of horror came over me, but I couldn't budge. Something inside me froze, as if my brain refused to believe what was happening. My heart was beating frantically, but my body wouldn't listen. At that moment I realized that what was sitting in front of me was not human. It was staring at me, unblinking, with an eerie, lifeless emptiness in its eyes, as if trying to penetrate my soul. I couldn't look away. I wanted to leave, but I was paralyzed by the horror, and that's when the creature began to move. It got up from the ground slowly, but unnaturally, jerkily, like a mechanical puppet that had forgotten how to move. Its body creaked like old furniture, and its movements seemed jerky and inconsistent. It swayed from side to side like it was learning to walk on two legs, and every movement felt like a mistake. My insides grew cold, my hands trembled, and my breathing became rapid and intermittent. I couldn't believe my eyes. There was something in front of me that shouldn't exist. I turned around and ran as fast as I could. I felt like my mind was about to burst with terror. The forest around me seemed too dense. The trees seemed to be trying to confuse me. I heard a strange sound behind me, the twitching footsteps of the creature. as if it were dragging its body behind it, moving from one end of the clearing to the other. The sound was wrong, not human. It was tumbling over like something huge and clumsy, but eerily alive. I heard it even through the sound of my own footsteps, through my heavy breathing and the sound of the wind starting to pick up again. Running into the mountains at night, with no trail and no map, was insane, but I couldn't stop now. Panic drove me forward, away from that fire and that creature. The further I went, the more I realized I couldn't go back. Staying alone in the mountains at night was deadly, but I couldn't stop. One thought pulsed in my head: it's after me. It won't let go. I ran without looking back, but the feeling that it was still there wouldn't leave me. I was lost. Everything around me was one big black swirl, and I couldn't see where I was. Darkness enveloped everything around me. Snow flickered under my feet, but fear kept me running. I thought that if I stopped, it would find me. My legs felt like lead. Every muscle in my body screamed in pain, but I couldn't stop. I could hear it behind me, the same sound that sounded more like the movement of something huge dragging its body across the ground than human footsteps. I was about to fall when a group of rocks appeared in front of me. They stood like giants, blocking the way ahead, and I realized that this was my only chance to get between them, to hide and camouflage myself from whatever was chasing me. I almost didn't know what I was doing, but by some miracle I found a small crevice between the rocks, wide enough to hide in. I squeezed into it and froze, trying not to breathe. The noise in my ears, the adrenaline in my blood, all of it muffled the sounds around me, but I knew it was here. It was looking for me. I could hear the creature moving somewhere nearby. Its strange footsteps, its jerks and rustles in the snow. It all seemed so unreal, but I knew it was real. It wasn't a dream. It wasn't a figment of the imagination. This something, an entity whose origin I couldn't understand, was there. I closed my eyes, feeling the cold penetrate my bones. Every breath hurt in my chest, and my heart was pounding so hard I feared it would give me away. But I couldn't move anymore. All I could do was wait and hope it would go away. I woke up without remembering how I'd lost consciousness. The early morning light illuminated everything around me, but the creature was gone. In 1998, I worked as a gamekeeper in the Elle Haler forest near Berlin. These places have always attracted tourists, especially in summer, when the pine trees were wrapped in a warm breeze and the needles creaked softly underfoot. The forest was quiet, even noble in its silence. But this story I am about to tell changed my perception of these majestic trees forever. At the time, Elle Haler was relatively unknown to the general tourist population, but the locals knew it like the back of their hand. They came here for the solitude, the enjoyment of nature, and the rare trails among the dense spruce forests and sparse meadows. I loved these trails, well maintained, but wild enough to retain a pristine spirit. The day it all started, I walked around my familiar territory. I met no one except two teenagers who had just parked at the edge of the road. The pair of teenagers looked cheerful, backpacks, spread blankets, and apparently a supply of food to spend the day away from the hustle and bustle of the city. They seemed pretty inexperienced to me, typical city people who had come to feel part of nature for a day. But they were friendly and wished me a good day with a smile as I passed by. A typical day as a gamekeeper rarely brings anything out of the ordinary. It's usually patrolling the forest, checking trails, urns, and occasionally meeting the likes of hikers. But the next day something strange began to happen. At dawn, I received a message from the local police station. The parents of those same teenagers had not been able to contact them for almost 24 hours. Their mobile phones were not answering, and the car, I was informed, was still parked at the same spot where I had seen it yesterday. It was strange. There were no depths in the Elle Haler forest where one could easily get lost. Most of the trails went back to one of the two main roads. I grabbed my quad bike keys and headed to the spot where I had seen the teenagers yesterday. The car was still there, as expected, but there was no sign of where they might have gone. Everything around seemed surprisingly quiet. No birds, no rustle of wind, just dead silence. That tugging feeling of unease began to build as I got closer to the car. Inside was a mess, but not the kind of mess that rushing around creates. Rather, it looked like things had been thrown around in a chaotic panic. We started searching with a few colleagues. The forest wasn't so big that they couldn't get far. We scoured the immediate neighborhood, shouting their names, but despite our efforts, we couldn't find even a hint of their presence. A day passed, then two, then a week. The locals began to worry too. This was not like a normal disappearance. The forest never took people without a trace. A week later, there was a strange encounter that still haunts me to this day. One of the local farmers, who sometimes looked into the forest for mushrooms, saw something unusual. I was with him that day when he told me that he had seen one of the missing teenagers. He was standing in the middle of the woods, absolutely motionless, covered in mud, with a frighteningly glassy stare. We went to the site, hoping for the best, but when we got there, we discovered something horrifying. I saw him first. He was standing among the trees, almost blending in with his surroundings. His clothes were torn and stained, his face was blank and expressionless, and his lips barely moved as if he were whispering something to himself. I moved closer, hoping to talk to him and find out what had happened. But when he noticed me, something unexpected happened. The guy let out an eerie, high-pitched squeal. It wasn't a human sound. I froze. He turned and ran into the woods, moving with some unnatural speed, almost like an animal. The farmer and I tried to catch up with him, but the forest seemed to swallow him. Branches whipped at our faces and bushes clung to our clothes, but the fellow disappeared as quickly as if he had never been there. The incident created a furor among the locals. Stories of ghosts haunting the forest began to spread with renewed vigor. People avoided the forest at sunset, and those who continued to enter it spoke of strange sounds. One such account particularly struck a chord with me. An old hunter told me that he heard someone whispering his name in the branches of the trees at night. Several weeks passed, and the search for the teenagers was called off. The feeling remained that the forest was hiding something. From time to time, the locals would find strange footprints on the ground or hear distant footsteps among the trees. I myself caught myself several times during my patrols hearing a whisper that seemed to ring between the pines. It was almost subtle, but still enough to make me listen and feel a chill on my skin. One evening, I went out on night patrol to check out another report of strange sounds. Taking my torch with me, I followed a familiar path that led deeper into the forest. The night was unaccustomedly quiet, but this sense of the presence of something alien only intensified. I walked slowly, each movement of the torch revealing bits of the dark forest where anything could be hiding behind every tree. When I had almost reached the middle of the trail, I stopped. Had I actually heard it, or was I imagining it? The sound was barely audible, but perfectly distinct. It was the same voice I'd heard from the teenager, a whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. I turned around, but the forest remained empty, though it seemed like someone was standing right behind me, watching. The whispers grew louder, and I felt the ground beneath my feet begin to shake, as if something huge was moving deep within the forest. I took a few steps back and pointed the torch toward where the sound was coming from. The light revealed a figure hiding among the trees. I didn't get a good look at it, but it wasn't human. It was too tall, with elongated limbs and empty eyes that seemed to devour the darkness around it. It made a low sound like laughter and vanished into the night. That night, I returned to the base without saying a word to anyone. All my stories about the strange events in the forest elicited only smirks from my colleagues, but I knew that Elle Haler would never be the same again.